Hey, what's up guys, Cave Productions here. In front of me you can tell that I have two Mac Minis. Now, would you be able to identify which one was the M1 Mac Mini and which one was not an M1 Mac Mini? Well, I wouldn't blame you if you couldn't because they pretty much look identical from the top. But I'm sure some of you may have noticed that there are some markings on this Mac and this one doesn't. So this one is obviously the more used one and this one is the more new one. Therefore, well, if you are more eagle-eyed, you will realize that this is the M1 Mac Mini and this is actually a 2014 Mac Mini. So, firstly, I know the timing of this video doesn't really make a lot of sense to you guys as the M1 Mac Mini was released last year. However, I only recently got my hands on an M1 Mac Mini, and as there are no new Macs this year at WWDC, I decided that maybe I'll do a review on the M1 Mac Mini. Now, why did I get the M1 Mac Mini? Well, I wasn't really gonna wait another half a year or even up to a year to upgrade from my old Macbook Pro 2016. I decided to get the M1 Mac Mini with the M1 chip as it will supposedly run circles around my 2016 MacBook Pro 6th generation dual-core Intel i5 SoC, right? Well, no spoilers here, but I think you're gonna find my findings pretty interesting. Let's get into the review. First of all, I want to get something out of the way. I will not be showing you any benchmarks as that is already plenty available on many other tech channels by now, so you can go and refer to those channels if you want to see specific numbers of how the M1 Mac compares to other Macs and other PCs. But rather, I'll be giving you my review of the M1 Mac Mini based on my daily usage of it, and as someone who owns a Windows gaming desktop and a 2016 13-inch MacBook Pro. I'll try to describe what kind of user I am as simply as possible in order to set a standard for this review. I mainly use both my MacBook and Windows desktop for daily menial tasks such as browsing Chrome, checking emails, watching YouTube. However, I do tend to do these stuff more often on my MacBook as it can be more convenient rather than having to turn on my Windows PC every time. When it comes to gaming, it's obviously a no-brainer to use my Windows PC or my Xbox One X. One thing that I do on my MacBook is that I don't do on my Windows PC or Xbox for obvious reasons is edit both my photos and videos. But mostly videos. Before this M1 Mac Mini, I edited all my videos on my seemingly poor dual-core MacBook with integrated Intel graphics using iMovie. So moving up to this M1 Mac Mini with 8 cores of CPU power and 8 cores of GPU power was surely to be an upgrade, right? Well, keep watching. Firstly, the unboxing experience is very Apple-like and is essentially unchanged from the last few generations of Mac Minis. All you get in the box is the Mac Mini itself, some paperwork with the Apple stickers, and the power cord. There is nothing else in the box as this is a BYODKM device as Steve Jobs would put it, so that means you have to bring your own display, keyboard and mouse and have it ready for this device. This is definitely the biggest difference between getting this Mac Mini and an iMac where all the accessories that you do need are provided in the iMac, but absent from the Mac Mini. Also, as compared to its previous generations where some Mac Minis supported either RAM upgrades or storage upgrades or even both, I think this is the first Mac Mini that has zero upgradability whatsoever. That means whatever you expect this Mac Mini to be at the checkout, it is pretty much what you get and there is no upgrading at all later down the road. And that is why you will see later in this video why I chose to spec my Mac Mini the way it is. Ever since I got my M1 Mac Mini, I have been editing all of my videos on the Mac Mini, except for one where I was still setting up the Mac Mini so I did use my MacBook Pro 2016. But after that video, including this one, I have been using Final Cut Pro on the M1 and have not edited on my MacBook Pro 2016 ever since. Now you may ask why did I choose to do this? Well, obviously because this is a new Mac and is technically more powerful than my MacBook Pro in every single way. Speaking of which, what are the specifications of the M1 Mac Mini? This M1 Mac Mini is rocking 16GB of RAM, which is up from the 8GB base option, and is also what my MacBook Pro 2016 have. My M1 Mac Mini also has a 10GB Ethernet port instead of the 1GB option that you will get as the base option. And lastly, my M1 Mac Mini has a whopping 2TB of SSD storage, which is 4 times that of my 512GB MacBook Pro 2016. In terms of CPU and GPU, it isn't really an apples to apples comparison here. My Mac Mini is rocking the M1 SoC with an 8-core CPU, of which 4 are low powered and 4 are high powered, with a maximum clock speed of 3.2 GHz. The M1 SoC also has a base variant of a 7-core GPU, but the one in the Mac Mini that you find over here is the 8-core variant. The M1 chip also features a 16-core neural engine for machine learning. The M1 SoC is based off of the ARM architecture and is what many people will put as a supercharged A14 Bionic chip. On the other hand, my MacBook Pro 2016 uses a 6th generation dual-core Intel Core i5 clocked at 2.9 GHz with an integrated Intel Iris Graphics 550. The Intel chip inside is based off of the x86 architecture we all know and sort of love. So right off the bat, just because of the architectural differences, the chips aren't already directly comparable. But that's fine because I'm here to compare them in terms of real-life usage and not based off of benchmarks. Firstly, it must be said that the Mac Mini has a pretty beefy cooling solution as compared to my MacBook Pros, which does have two fans but in a chassis that is pretty thin, so the cooling solution just isn't really close to that of the big fan and relatively large heatsink that you'll find in the Mac Mini. I'll also like to mention that the size of the fan here in the Mac Mini is pretty large. It is the same size and vent design as the 2018 Mac Mini, but if we compare it to the 2014 Mac Mini, we can see that the vents on the 2014 Mac Mini is quite a bit smaller and slimmer, which gives the 2020 M1 Mac Mini much better cooling due to that larger vent. Alright, so let's move on to the comparison between the two Macs that I'll be comparing, which is the MacBook Pro and this M1 Mac Mini, in everyday usage. In this category for everyday to day use, there is not really a match here. The M1 Mac Mini just feels so much more fluid and it feels really close to a lag-free experience. Apps open up really fast and they close really fast. There is really very little delay between clicking of apps and them opening. In older Macs running Intel chips, when you do click on the app, sometimes they do bounce about a bit on the dock before the app actually opens up. Now that still does happen sometimes on the M1 Mac Mini, but you can generally just go along the bottom and click all the apps and they'll open up all in an instant one by one, which is really amazing and fast as compared to an Intel Mac, which slowly opens them one by one. Of course, we do have to take into account that the MacBook Pro 2016 is no longer young and the chip is maybe slightly worn out from being used so much and after all these years. In terms of the drive, it isn't really full, it's only about half full, so I wouldn't blame it on the drive being slow. But I'm quite certain that even if it was a clean MacBook Pro 2016 fresh off the factory, it would not be able to match the level of speed that the M1 Mac Mini was able to show off because of a combination of factors such as the Intel CPU being a 6th generation chip and running on a different architecture with less optimization as compared to the M1. Now do note that all of those apps that can run on an ARM architecture are running on ARM on my M1 chip. I did not force any of the apps like Safari or Chrome to use Rosetta, but there is an option to do so just in case you want to run them using the x86 architecture. Also, if you do have apps that cannot run natively on ARM, you can download Rosetta by going into an application in the Finder and use a two-finger click to open an app like Safari, click Get Info and select Run using Rosetta. A prompt will then come up asking you to download Rosetta. This can also be done by downloading an x86 program and trying to run it. A prompt will come up asking you to download Rosetta when you do try to run that app for the first time. Now moving on to the next test, start up and wake up from sleep. There really isn't a comparison here and the M1 is just much faster than the MacBook Pro 2016 in the time it takes to turn on and wake up from sleep, probably due to how well the M1 chip is optimized for macOS. Now let's move on to the next part where the M1 should definitely crush the MacBook Pro in, and that is video editing. To test this, I took a Final Cut Pro library file and copied it to both my M1 and MacBook Pro. I then ran an export at 4K 30fps for both machines. That's right, I'm just as confused as you right now. The MacBook Pro 2016 actually beat my M1 Mac and with quite a comfortable lead as well, about 2 minutes. I even ran this test multiple times and every single time, my MacBook Pro did beat my M1 even in back-to-back tests. That is quite weird as I honestly don't really know how to explain this. My only theory is that Final Cut Pro has yet to be fully optimized for the M1 chips and therefore still runs better on x86. Unfortunately, there is no way to run Final Cut Pro using Rosetta on the M1, so I can't really do an apples to apples comparison here. Also, in case anyone asks, I shall explain a few things. No, it was definitely not the thermals on the M1 as the M1 was very quiet throughout the whole export and barely got any warmer than it was when it was at idle. In fact, between the two, the MacBook Pro should have been the one to thermal throttle given its much weaker cooling solution compared to the M1. But it did manage to hold its ground, although it did get much warmer than the M1 and the fans had to ramp up and sound like a jet engine. But even after all of that, although the MacBook Pro did feel considerably warmer, it still beat out my M1 Mac Mini in the video export. So at least in my case, it's confirmed that the MacBook Pro 2016 is actually faster than my M1 in terms of export speed for Final Cut Pro, which is quite mind-boggling to be honest. How can a dual-core CPU with a lower clock speed combined with Intel Iris graphics beat out my brand new M1 Mac Mini with an 8-core CPU and an 8-core GPU? Well, I'm no Linus Tech Tips and I have no idea why this is happening, but I'll be more than happy to learn why. So if any of you have any idea as to why this is happening, do let me know down in the comments below. But that's not the end of my test. Although the results were kind of weird in Final Cut Pro, I decided to do the same test in iMovie. And guess what? The M1 actually did beat my MacBook Pro 2016 and quite comfortably as well. It almost felt like kind of a role reversal. So why is this happening? Again, I have no idea. It could be the reason I just explained for Final Cut Pro, but in reverse. Essentially, iMovie may now be more optimized for the M1 SoC as compared to an Intel SoC, especially a 6th generation mobile SoC from Intel. But if you ask me why the iMovie application is much more optimized for the M1 as compared to the Final Cut Pro, then I'm not really sure why. Lastly, let's talk about gaming on my M1 Mac. And my experience is that it's definitely far better than my MacBook Pro 2016, but it still leaves a lot to be desired. In a game like World of Tanks, you can hit a good 30 FPS on high settings at 1080p, but there are some bugs with the game and I think it's down to the fact that World of Tanks is not optimized for ARM-based systems. For example, the game has issues rendering things when you decide to crank up the anti-aliasing to the max, but that's not really a very big issue. If you drop the quality down to medium settings, then the game does get a considerably smooth 45 FPS. As you can see though, the mouse scrolling is reversed on the Mac and so it was messing up my scrolling in and out of sniper mode in the game. So if you are coming from a Windows PC, then I'd recommend changing the scrolling mode on your Mac in System Preferences. Another game I decided to test was Minecraft. And in short, Minecraft is definitely playable on the M1 Mac, but not at max settings in 1080p. When I maxed out everything at 1080p, I was getting roughly between 15 FPS to about 25 FPS. Sometimes you do get 30 and even upwards of 50 from time to time, but those are kind of more like frame spikes. I did also get a lot of stutter and it was because of the lack of RAM that was allocated. By default, Minecraft only allocates about 1GB of RAM to the game. So I increased the allocated RAM to 2GB and the results were much better than before. Now the frames weren't stuttering a lot, but they were more or less still about the same. When you set the draw distance and entity distance in half, the game gets a lot more playable. You get a minimum frame rate of about 30 plus FPS and you do hit the high 50s and up to 60 FPS from time to time much more often. Do take note that I was using VSync and my monitor is only 60Hz, but I guess it didn't really matter as the game's average FPS at these settings were only about 40 to 45 FPS. So in general, gaming is definitely possible on the M1 Mac, albeit with lower settings like medium at 1080p, in order to get a playable experience in games like Minecraft and World of Tanks. But if you must game and you want a decent experience, then you should either go for a console or a Windows PC with a much more beefy dedicated graphics card. Also, side note, although the M1 Mac Mini is really cool for most tasks that I do throw at it, it was at its warmest here when I was trying to use it to play some games. It did get slightly warm when I was using Final Cut Pro and during exports, but for the most part, it was still really cool and blowing out relatively cold air, much better than my 2014 Mac Mini. When I did use the Mac Mini for gaming, the air that was coming out of the Mac Mini's vent was actually warm. So that goes to show that gaming still stresses out most Mac systems and the M1 Mac Mini is no exception here. Lastly, before I wrap up, I want to make a small mention on the Magic Trackpad 2. I used the Magic Trackpad 1 with my old Mac Mini 2014 and I really enjoyed the experience. I still think Apple makes some of the best trackpads out there. So I had to get the Magic Trackpad 2 for my Mac Mini as they updated the design from the diving board mechanism to the force touch mechanism, which I really like. The taptic engine still feels really natural and it really feels like you're doing a click even though there is actually no moving part. It is pretty much the only accessory that I decided to get with my M1 Mac Mini as I already had a mouse and keyboard. As you can see, I already have my Keychron K8 keyboard, so I didn't have to get another keyboard or a Magic Keyboard from Apple as this keyboard can connect to 3 different devices at one time. So I have one profile set to my Windows PC and I have the second one to my Mac Mini. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, the Magic Trackpad 2 is 169 Singapore dollars for the silver one, and more expensive for the space grey one. So unless you really like the aesthetics of the space grey trackpad, then you should go for the cheaper silver Magic Trackpad 2. So let's start to wrap up here. I know this isn't as comprehensive of a review as many of you would have liked it to be, with benchmarks and everything, but a lot of that already exists. But I'm more of an everyday type of user that likes to look at real life usage rather than focus on the benchmark numbers. And that's why I compared the export time of both machines as well as the general speed of which they open apps and wake up from sleep, or boot, and so on. In general, my M1 Mac Mini is definitely an improvement over my aging 13-inch MacBook Pro. The M1 chip is much more capable as compared to the old 6th generation Intel SoC. However, as you can see from the results in the video, more optimization needs to be done in order to get the most out of this machine. This is especially so in first-party apps like Final Cut Pro, where it is embarrassing to see my old MacBook Pro destroy my brand new M1 Mac in export speed. But when it comes to other things, such as booting up your M1 Mac or waking it up from sleep, or even opening multiple apps in quick succession, there is no doubt that the optimization of the macOS and M1 chip definitely helps the Mac Mini to fly through these tasks really quickly. If you're someone who already has a monitor, keyboard, and mouse, and you don't need to carry your Mac around, then the M1 Mac Mini is definitely the best value and cheapest Mac to get. You can even upgrade the Mac Mini to the Max and it will still be rather affordable compared to something like an Intel MacBook Pro from 2020. However, with many rumors floating around of a new Mac Mini with an updated M1X chip or M2 chip, you may just want to wait a little longer to get your hands on what is definitely going to be a superior Mac Mini, although it is rumored to be quite a bit more expensive. But I don't know when this new Mac Mini will launch as well, so if you really need a new video editing machine right now, then don't wait and get the M1 Mac Mini 2020, as it is still a really capable machine. If you don't need one right now, however, and you can hold on to your old Mac or wait a little longer, then you can maybe choose to take a look at all the rumors floating around and make your decision from there. Anyways, that's about it for this video. If you like this video, do give it a thumbs up, share this video if you found it useful, and please subscribe and hit the bell notification icon as it really helps this channel out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.